Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and I have a pretty exciting video today because Blizzard just put out a blog post on the Boomsday project revealing a new card, which we're going to talk about soon, but also teasing some ideas, I think, for legendary spells and a couple other cards that we might see in the Boomsday project. So you guys know how I am. I'm all about conspiracies, all about theory crafting, all about trying to guess what's going to come in the Boomsday project because I'm super hyped like everybody else. So I thought we'd go through and break down this blog post a little bit. Before we do, of course, the first thing I want to focus on is the new card that was revealed, and this will be the only real card in this entire video. This is the Menacing Nimbus that you'll see on your screen, a new Shaman 2-mana minion. I'm not going to do a full review in this video, that'll come later, but of course I do want to talk about it a little bit. Here you've got a nice cheap body. The 2/2 stat line is not by any means amazing for a 2-mana minion, but you've got some real strong value generation here, adding an extra elemental to your hand. Now, traditionally, with what we've seen with elemental shaman decks, they're not super value-oriented. They're typically something that falls more along a tempo line. They do have cards that generate resources, but normally you're more concerned with getting out onto the board, maintaining minions, maintaining that tempo, and pressuring your opponent. So this is kind of a mix of both of those worlds. It falls more in like the Servant of Kalamos line than perhaps like the Fire Elemental line, one being more about generating stuff, one being more about playing towards the board. And it really just depends on what kind of elemental shaman you're expecting to play or what you want your deck to be. I think almost in either case, this could be a serviceable little tool just because having those cheap, flexible elementals is really nice when it comes to keeping your elemental chains activating turn after turn, setting up for future Kalamoses or Blaze Callers or whatever else it might be that's in your deck. So clearly the kind of card that could see play. I don't think it's ever going to be absolutely amazing. You know, occasionally it will turn into a second Kalamos, and that's going to be awesome. Other times it'll just be a Firefly or a Murmuring Elemental or something that might not have quite as much utility, but will never really be a downside or a backfire. So solid little card, definitely something that could be cool in Arena. It's the exact kind of card you might want in Arena. Not going to necessarily blow anything up or completely change how Elemental Shaman works, but an interesting little piece of the puzzle nonetheless. So that's the only real card in this blog post. Shame there's not more. I thought we'd see 2 or 3 cards today, to be honest, but I'll take one. That's still exciting stuff, and a good sign that at least Elemental Shaman's going to be getting some love. Maybe not like Freeze or Totem, but seems like Elementals are there with Electra Storm Surge too, so maybe we're trapped on this line for Shaman. That's okay. But that said, there are some other things. I'm not going to read this entire blog post in this video. I think that would be insane and boring. You can find this blog post and read it yourself. And it's worth it. It's fun. It's really cool. The theme and the fantasy of this expansion so far are awesome. They did a fantastic job writing this as well. So you can't go wrong there. And essentially what this blog post is all about, if you don't know, it's kind of a like a journal entries of the scientists of Dr. Boom, which we've already been teased with Luna and Electra Storm Surge, these different scientists that work under Dr. Boom. And there are 3 in particular that are reporting their findings or talking about what they've been working on for Dr. Boom. And Luna is up first, and she says a bunch of stuff. But then there's this image that's particularly interesting and a line here at the bottom as well that is very intriguing and I think might be a sign regarding Luna's associated legendary spell, because of course I'm still maintaining the conspiracy that there's going to be a scientist and an associated legendary spell. We saw that with Myra's unstable element for Rogue. We're assuming Myra is the named scientist and the unstable element is whatever thing she's working on. And in this case, now we know that Luna is actually working on a pocket galaxy. And that's what you see here. You can read a little bit. Behold the tools of creation, an entire simulated galaxies. Its energies tamed, its harmonies harnessed, small enough to slip into a pocket. And that's a neat idea. The idea that she's creating something that will hold other things. And I thought, well, what if we made a custom card to predict what that might look like? As I always do, so that's not it. Oh, I skipped a thing. I gotta go back to that. But here's a custom card I made for Luna's Pocket Galaxy. And again, this is a custom card, not real, just me theory crafting based on the artwork and the description where she's talking about taking a lot of stuff and putting it into a smaller thing. So the idea for this spell is it could be a big removal tool for Mage, almost in a way like Twisting Nether, but it's considerably cheaper at 6 mana, and I guess almost in a way kind of like Psychic Scream as well, because it doesn't actually destroy the minions, it would just move them into a separate place like Psychic Scream, so it wouldn't do things like activate Death Rattles. But it would absorb all minions into a Pocket Galaxy, which would summon a new minion on the board, as you can see on the left side of the screen there, and when that minion died, it would re-release all of those minions back into the field. So it's this temporary kind of stall, almost like a Frost Nova in a way, but it leaves board space open for your opponent. And of course, they can pretty quickly, if they have the right tools, re-release their minions. But they have to dedicate mana and have to have some sort of direct target or single target removal to destroy the Pocket Galaxy, because of course they won't have any minions on board with initiative when you pass the turn back to them. So it causes all these different little interactions to happen right away. And your opponent has to say, well, do I fully reload the board? If I had 7 minions on board and I play 4 minions now and then I kill the Pocket Galaxy, I'm not going to have the board space to resummon all of my minions. So I might inadvertently kill a few things while reloading the board. Do I need to take this sort of stopgap turn, or I do something else because I know my minions are coming back eventually? Is he just buying time to flame strike my minions once they come out? There are all these different decisions and strategic elements that happen. But ultimately, it's just kind of stalling for a turn with Luna's Pocket Galaxy. You're not necessarily removing anything. So as a removal tool, it's somewhat limited. Now that said, of course, Mage does have ways to kill their own Pocket Galaxy, so you could use this in an offensive fashion as well if you wanted, perhaps. If you had a bunch of stuff you wanted to keep on board, like Sorcerer's Apprentices to set up some sort of combo, maybe you could play a couple Sorcerer's Apprentices, Pocket Galaxy them, hope your opponent doesn't have an answer to your Pocket Galaxy, they can't transform it, they can't kill it, and then you lead back into a combo turn of your own, so there's kind of this dual utility. Beyond that, a Mage can actually polymorph their own Pocket Galaxy, because if this gets transformed, of course, the Death Rattle doesn't resolve, and your opponent doesn't get their minions back. So you could have this sort of 10 mana, 2 card board clear where you play Luna's Pocket Galaxy, you polymorph your Pocket Galaxy, and all of your opponent's stuff is gone forever. That's a pretty big commitment and a lot of resources, but a possible way to deal with tons of stuff, which I think a legendary spell needs to be strong and impactful. So I love the idea of this card. Maybe, of course, the mana costs are off. Maybe the Pocket Galaxy should just be like a 0/1 so it could get pinged, or at least something smaller. Who knows? But I think this idea and theme match up really nicely with what Blizzard has teased here, and could indeed be something that we see, and that would be pretty darn awesome. I like that card. Now, before I forget, I do want to jump back and talk about one other thing that's me going really, really deep here on these theory crafting trips, these conspiracies, and that is a line here, a throwaway line from Luna, where she says, she references what I think to be another scientist, and she says that multiplying moron Zarek. So I think Zarek is another scientist, and of course I wanted a theorycraft card for a scientist who might multiply himself, perhaps using cloning tools or who knows what else. So I made, not that, I made this, Zarek the Duplicitous for Priest. And this would be an 8 mana 3/3, which, terrible stat line, right? But it reads, at the end of your turn, summon an exact copy of this minion. So if you played this out on your own, you would get 2 3/3s at the end of your turn, but keep in mind that both of them would say, at the end of your turn, summon an exact copy of this minion. So you can see how every time that essentially doubles, it's this exponential growth that starts happening. And clearly, if your opponent doesn't start to resolve these, you're just going to have an infinite supply of Zarek the Duplicitouses. And that's a bit reminiscent of something like Grim Patron. Perhaps that's why I went with the 3/3 stat line here. But with Priest in particular, of course, they have some interesting ways to buff a card like this. So if they had a Radiant Elemental on board, perhaps they could play like a Power Word Shield and a Divine Spirit, and they could have a 3/10 on board. And then that gets doubled into a second 3/10. And they have 2 3/10s for 8 mana, and suddenly that's starting to look crazy. If they had an Inner Fire, they could be 10/10s. That's pretty nuts too. So there are all kinds of interesting ways for Priest to get sort of extra value out of a card like Zarek the Duplicitous, but still, of course, fairly susceptible to trading on board, to single target removal. Your opponent might be able to keep up pretty quickly. And if you do have to use multiple Divine Spirit and Inner Fires on a card like this, that's a pretty passive turn. You're not really accomplishing anything right away. You're using those resources for board presence as opposed to damage, which they're typically far better utilized for. So I'm not sure that would necessarily work amazingly in a deck. A lot of people are going to scream this is overpowered, I think, because it can just get crazy snowballed. You could make 10/10s that summon 10/10s that summon 10/10s. But there's answers, there's silences, there's board wipes, there's polymorphs, there's just trades on the board into the normal stat lines. And if a priest has to save up that many cards and resources to make one power turn that's still susceptible to a Twisting Nether, that doesn't have taunt, that's slow on the board, that's going to fail a lot of the time. But nonetheless, I think the kind of card that Blizzard would design and thematically matches the idea here teased by Stargazer Luna quite a bit. So maybe Zarek the Duplicitous will look something like the actual card, if this is in fact even one of Dr. Boom's scientists. But we'll see. I like the pun at the very least, so I'm happy with that one. Now, moving on, another thing teased here, there's a few cards left that they tease, is the next one up here is the Mulch Muncher, and this is in the section of Libidinous Loop. That's the name. I guess I'm guessing that's the Druid Dr. Boom scientist. It could theoretically be Hunter, but it seems like it's Druid because he's talking all about growing plants and all kinds of crazy stuff. And he mentions one of these Mulch Muncher units that he's hoping to get. So I thought, hey, there's some nice artwork here for a Mulch Muncher. Let's try to create a Mulch Muncher minion. And of course, it would be a mech for Druid. And the idea here is that if it's munching on mulch, and I think there's some idea here that plants are a little bit related to mana growth, as we've seen in the past with like wild growth, for instance. We can kind of connect the dots there. And if he's eating mulch, if he's eating plants, I think perhaps he has some sort of positive interaction with mana where he's doing something cool, powering up when he eats mana. So for the Mulch Muncher, starts out as a 3-mana 2/2, but he gains +1/+1 for each unused mana crystal you have at the end of your turn. So for instance, you play this on turn 3, he's just a 2/2. You play this on turn 5, he is suddenly a 4/4, which is not great for turn 5. He's always going to be a little bit understated for whatever amount of mana you commit to him, right? Because he's understated from the start. So if you played this on turn 10, he's a 9/9. And a 10-mana 9/9 is ultimately not very exciting for anybody. But there's a couple advantages to a card like this. I'm not saying this would be an amazing card that's played all the time, but it has some upsides. Namely is that it doesn't necessarily go away. It can last through multiple turns, which means any time that you float mana, this card adds on that value. It doesn't do it immediately, so it can't attack right away. It gets it passively for the next turn, so you're always kind of on a backlog of the advantage of those buffs, but it might make it a little bit harder to remove, might make it stick, and you can start to utilize your mana in a very interesting way as Druid, whereas sometimes you have to float a ton of mana with Druid because you ramped and you don't necessarily have ways to fill in the gaps. So that's some upside. If it lives for 3 or 4 turns and you had him, 5, 6, 7 mana to float, you got a really big minion for only 3 mana that's becoming a bigger and bigger headache and a bigger threat for your opponent to answer all the time, which is nice. Also, just having the flexibility of a card that is low cost in the early game but becomes still relatively useful in the late game, that's always nice. So you can play this on turn 5 and get an okay minion if you're just desperate. And if you have to play it on turn 10, you still get an okay minion. So this would be a really scary threat in Arena, like absurdly good in Arena. It might be too good, maybe even in Arena. In Standard, I think it'd be far more balanced and a neat idea. I don't even know that it'd be played all that much, but a pretty cool card nonetheless, and I think a fairly realistic design for what Blizzard would like to do, and hopefully one that matches up with the theme teased here in the blog post as well. Now, beyond that, we actually do have a preview here of Libidinous Loop, and I'm guessing this is what he looks like, some kind of incredible Hulk broccoli-looking dude. Pretty cool design, I gotta say. He's like an ooze that is, brought to life and intelligent, which is neat. Maybe he'll have something to do with weapon removal, I don't know. But it doesn't give us a whole lot of details on what he's going to do, so I didn't want to create a custom card here. He mostly just talks about growing stuff and growing plants. I didn't see anything to attach to for a custom card, so I'm not going to do one for Floop himself. I can't wait to see what it is because he looks awesome, but there's no custom card here. That said, he does talk about his Gloop a little bit, and there's even a picture here of his Gloop, and his intern Kevin gets glooped, and he dissolves. And it says essentially, my glorious gloop is glowing, fascinating. In addition to its incredible properties as an ultra fertilizer, I have hypothesized that the gloop stores the potential energy of the matter it dissolves. So I think what we're going to see here is Floop that destroys / dissolves something and then turns that something into mana. So I want to design a card that had some version of that action happening, and here it is, Flutes Gloop. There are about a dozen different ways to do this. I thought about doing it on your opposing minions. I thought about doing it on your own minions. I thought about making it a big spell that kind of refunded mana. But ultimately I ended up with this Flutes Gloop. It's just the best name ever for a Hearthstone card as far as I'm concerned. And this would be a 2-mana legendary spell for Druid. And this could, by the way, be a minion. Some of the reading on this makes me think it could be a minion that attacks and whatever it kills gives you mana based on their mana cost. But there's some kind of feedback loop happening here with killing something and getting mana or energy. Energy could also perhaps be translated as health, but I think it sounds like mana to me. So anyway, Flutes Gloop, 2 mana, destroy a friendly minion, gain mana crystals equal to its cost this turn only. So Flutes Gloop is in a way a super innervate if you're willing to sacrifice a minion. So perhaps that sounds like, you know, more of a warlock thing, sacrificing your own minions, but its connection to mana and the fact that he destroyed his own assistant, Kevin, in the blog story here makes me think perhaps this is going to happen on friendly minions instead. So the idea here being that this could give you like really big mana in a pinch to do something super cool. So maybe it's to set up some sort of combo play where if you stick a 4-mana minion on the board and you want to play a Malygos and then you Flutes Gloop your 4-mana minion, you essentially get 2 total mana regained because you spent 2 to gain 4. If you somehow had an 8-mana minion that was still on the board, then you could cast Flutes Gloop to destroy your 8-mana minion and gain 8 mana back, or a total gain of 6 for your Flutes Gloop. So it could do some crazy innervate stuff, but the cost being, of course, you had to have that minion out there for it to make sense, which means your opponent could remove it. They might know you're a combo deck. They might have answers to that. And of course, you have to sacrifice your thing, which you don't really want to do. You're sort of you know, spending that mana previously to get it back later at a cost because you're losing the minion in the process. So it's not like technically an efficient sort of mana gain, but it could still set up neat tricks. For instance, think about something like where if you played a Leroy Jenkins, a charged minion, to end the game, because you want to end the game, you attack face with your Leroy, then you Flutes Gloop your Leroy, and you get a total gain of 3 mana back. So maybe that sets up like a double swipe play that wouldn't have otherwise been possible, so now you can do 14 damage with hand if you have double swipe Leroy and Flutes Gloop. Otherwise, you can't cast Leroy double swipe because you don't have enough mana. You could innervate, of course, there's other ways to do it, but based on standard hand. So that would be a cool way to squeeze in lots of extra stuff. And you could extrapolate that even farther. If you stuck a Lich King on board and it lived through the turn, you attacked your opponent for 8, you destroy your Lich King, you play a Malygos, or excuse me, you play a Malygos, you destroy your Lich King, you get 6 mana regained. You still have some amount of 7 mana left on the turn, so you have 7 mana for Malygos because you stuck a Lich King. Like, that's insane. You could swipe Moonfire, and do hero power or something. Like, tons of damage is possible with something like Flutes Gloop, but still hard to work with. If your opponent knows the deal and they can clear minions every turn, then it's not going to work nearly as well for a Malygos sort of combo. Could still work always in a Leroy sort of environment. And this is something you don't want to cast a lot of the times, right? So sometimes it's going to be a dead card that sits in your hand because you don't want to kill your stuff. You need your stuff, and you never want to play a Lich King and destroy it on the same turn. That wouldn't make sense. You'd just lose your mana. That would have no value. You could use it with Battlecry minions, though. If some minion has a really positive Battlecry and you want to play that at a discount, that's a possibility for a card like Flutes Gloop. So some neat utility here, some neat combo setup, some neat potential for how to use this card, but I don't think it does anything crazy overpowered. Maybe it does. Maybe somebody in chat will tell me. As always, I'm not super worried about the balance here. I'm more worried about the theme and the idea and exploring some of the teased mechanics that Blizzard has implemented in this blog post. So now I have one last thing I want to talk about. As you move into Electra Storm Surge's section of the blog post, we already met Electra Storm Surge. We know that card, and we've seen the new card that's also revealed here. There's one last thing at the end of this that Blizzard teases, and it talks about this Conductor Core where if you overload minions with all this power and electricity, that they get more powerful. And in fact, it even teases the word power overwhelming. So that sounded to me like, man, this is something that's gonna buff your minions, right? It's gonna make your minions bigger, and it's probably the project or the thing that Electra has been working on. So this must be Shaman's legendary spell. And of course, I made a version of it. This is Electra's Conductor Core, a 4-mana spell that synergizes with Overload. Obviously, we're talking about infusing power into things. It sounds like overloading, overcharging your mana crystals. So this 4-mana spell is a board-wide buff. Friendly minions gain +1/+1 for each overloaded mana crystal you gain this turn. Now, that is not the same as something like Unbound Elemental, which is for overload cards played. This would specifically be for the crystals. So if you played Electra's Conductor Core and then you played, say for instance, Earth Elemental with an overload of 3, every minion you have on the board would gain +3/+3, including the Earth Elemental, because it's friendly minions this turn. So you get this really cool big board buff, or at the least a very opportunity to buff things you're about to play. Now, the way overloaded mana crystals work, in most cases, the overload cost is lower than the total cost of the minion. So your max output here is usually going to be about +6/+6, which admittedly is a huge buff across an entire board. And you might say, whoa, that's too powerful. That's really, really good, particularly if you have stuff on board already and you get to attack with that. That's like a super Bloodlust, Regis. That's crazy. Well, first off, the card should be good. It's a legendary spell. It needs to be strong. It needs to be worthwhile. Otherwise, you're not going to run a one of unless it does something significant. But of course, as always, it's hard to find yourself in those situations because this isn't just a normal token deck that can go super wide on the board. You're having to play this in a deck with lots of overload cards. And if you look at the overload cards available to Shaman, many of them are oriented more along a control game plan than, say, an aggressive token wide board sort of game plan. So yes, you might always have totems lingering around for a Conductor Core buff. That's great, but I don't think you're typically going to be able to play this with 5 or 6 minions, and it's also going to be really tough to get the full overload utilization because you have to have the right cards in hand. Typically, you'd have to have space on the board if you really wanted to maximize the buff potential. So there are some limits and some checks and balances built into this, I think. Of course, as always, I'm not saying this is perfectly balanced. Tweak the numbers, I don't care. I'm more worried about the theme and the idea than the balance. I've said that a million times, but I still think it'd be slightly okay because Overload itself is pretty punishing. It's hard to line up mana. You'd have to have the exact right assortment of stuff, which means you're saving cards. You're not playing optimally all the time, and there are some real compromises made. There is one exception, I think, to the Overload equation, which is Dust Devil. I guess that's a 1-mana card that gives you 2 overloads. If you had a couple of those, maybe you could go absolutely ham with something like this, and they'd be some pretty insane buffed Wind Fury minions, but it's always still susceptible to the twisting nethers of the world and so many other things that even if you set up some bonkers turn and you manage to survive until that point, there's still a lot of ways for Hearthstone to answer those sorts of things. So if that ever became a dominant force in the meta, there'd probably be some stuff that could address it pretty easily. The biggest threat for something like this might actually be Snow Fury Giants, building a big Ancestral Spirit Snow Fury Giants board. But again, just because you've only got 6 mana, at the end of the day are, 14/14 giants that resummon that much better than 8/8s? A little bit, but usually if you slam 4 8/8 giants that are resummoning themselves in some sort of overload giant deck, that's often enough to win the game anyway. So in a lot of ways, you could say this is either a win more card or a finisher card that's probably worse than Bloodlust a lot of the time, just because it's more awkward to use and you have to have the right sort of stuff in hand to make it good at all. So kind of a bad Bloodlust sometimes, kind of a win more card sometimes. It looks scary at first glance, but I don't actually think it'd be all that oppressive. So that means I don't have anything left. Those are the the takeaways for me, the conspiracy theories, the cool ideas that I came up with looking at this post and kind of theory crafting based on some of the stuff they teased. Some people might say this is a waste of time. I don't care. It's fun. It's really cool to talk about what these new cards could look like and think about ideas, and who knows, maybe we'll inspire somebody at Blizzard someday to see this sort of thing, and they might come up with an even better idea, a more balanced version of my cards. But I encourage you guys to read this blog post. Of course, there's probably going to be more, so check out those too. This does say part 1, so we have to presume there will be more lab logs to give us more insights and perhaps even more card reveals. That said, of course, stay tuned here on my YouTube channel. I'll be doing more card reviews when there's more cards. I don't want to do a review for just 2 cards, which is all that's out right now that I haven't reviewed. As soon as we get a 3rd or 4th one, I'll pop out more reviews. And of course, when we move into review season in full, there will be lots and lots of card reviews as always. Until then, it's going to be more theory crafting and more fun and more hype, because there's so much cool stuff to imagine and picture for the Boomsday project. That said, share your thoughts on these cards, the new card itself, what you think some of these hints and clues in this blog post might mean. But until then, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.